All right, we are almost done with our study of Matthew. We have this Sunday, Matthew 26. We'll look at the Lord's table today, actually. And then next week, we'll have a missionary here. And as far as I know, I'll be in Morris next Sunday, filling in there. I'm scheduled to, and I haven't heard otherwise. So next Sunday, it's good timing that we have a missionary next Sunday. Then the Sunday after, we'll look at Matthew 27 and 28. And then we'll kind of have, since we've been in this study for quite a while, we'll just have one Sunday to kind of wrap up and conclude our study on the book of Matthew. And then, as I mentioned last Sunday, after this I'd like to do a short series. Right now it's just 5 weeks on the story of Pilgrim's Progress. So how many of you have read Pilgrim's or listened to Pilgrim's Progress? Have we had a few? Okay, so I'm warning you ahead of time by the Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. If you want to get a copy of it or an audio copy of it, you have time. It's worth reading, which is why it's worth spending time in Sunday school to talk about. So I'd like to do that, and I am almost 100% positive it's been translated into Spanish as well. Pilgrim's Progress has been translated into many languages. So I would like to do that. All right, so now back to Matthew 26. We're in the final section of the book, Matthew 26 through 28, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus has been, since Matthew 16, and I don't think I have the slides here today, yeah. So Matthew 16, by way of, just to remind us, Jesus reveals to his disciples, and Matthew then does to us, that there are two purposes for Jesus coming to earth the first time. Okay, so is Jesus the Messiah? The answer to that question is yes. But Jesus has to die for the sins of the whole world. And this is something that was taught in the Old Testament, but the exact ramifications of that were not well known to his disciples. So even in Matthew 16, Jesus says, I have to go to Jerusalem, I have to die, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again the third day. And this is the famous story where Peter says, no, Lord, I'm not going to let you go to Jerusalem and die. Okay, and he says, get behind me, Satan. Your will is contrary to the will of God. Okay? The will of God is that the Son of God must suffer and die for the sins of the whole world. And you remember that John the Baptist introduces Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the whole world. So this is kind of new, but Jesus continues to instruct his disciples along these lines. So Matthew is using the Lord's table to demonstrate, I think, this thing that Jesus is both the king, but he's the king who must die for the sins of his people. And now he's looking at those two things. And of course, we'll get into that. I was going to show a slide, and I didn't put it together in time. There's a poem, so you'll have to work with me for just a second. There's a poem by George Herbert. He was a pastor in the 17th century, 18th century, who wrote poetry. And it's very good. If you ever get a chance to read it, I would encourage you. He has one that's called The Altar. Now, the altar, one of the altars in the Old Testament is made of stone. And the prophet Jeremiah uses the expression that God is going to take away the heart of stone of his people and give them a heart of flesh. And this is a picture of salvation. So you have an altar which is made of stone, You have a heart of stone, which is exchanged for a heart of flesh. And then Jesus says to the Pharisees who trust in Abraham as their father, you recall this story, Jesus says that even if Abraham had no children, God would have the what? The stones cry out in praise. So George Herbert writes this poem called The Altar, where he makes a play on this word stone. Well, my heart is an altar, but I'm saved, so I have a heart of flesh. But what happens if my heart of flesh were to become cold like a stone? Well, then, God, he prays, let the stones cry out in praise. Even if my heart were to become stone again, let it cry out in praise to you. And he uses this illustration, this analogy of the stone in these different ways, and he pulls them all together. It's a fabulous poem. Something similar in that it is complex is happening in Matthew 26 at the Last Supper. And it has to do with the bread and the blood, primarily the blood. But we're going to be looking at both of these today. So in Matthew 26, in verse 26, we'll read that first here. So Matthew records it in this way, and Mark and Luke are similar but a little different, and we read from 1 Corinthians 11. There's a fly buzzing around my face. I got your fly, Daryl. Mark and Luke are similar. Luke actually has a very interesting difference, which we won't talk about today. And then 1 Corinthians 11, Pastor read from this morning. But Matthew 26, starting in verse 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Okay, so there are two elements to the Lord's table. There's the bread and there's the blood, and both of them are symbolic. There's an Old Testament symbolism to both of these around the Passover supper. So I put down some Old Testament references to that effect. In Deuteronomy 16, and I think this is on your handout, so, but I'll flip around here and look at these. Deuteronomy 16, verses 1 through 8. It says, "Observe the month of Abib," which now is April. So the Passover used to change. It would be held at different times throughout the year because of the Jewish calendar. When Christ was crucified, it happened to be in the month of Abib, which is our April. Today, roughly our April time of year. The Jewish people fixed the Passover meal to always be in our April later in time. So now the Jewish holidays don't rotate around the calendar. They stay relatively put. But anyway, it just happened to be the same. It just happened. Obviously, it didn't just happen to be that way, but it is that way. All right, so observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. And you shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock or the herd at the place that the Lord will choose to make his name dwell there. This is actually a prophecy of the promised land of Israel and of Jerusalem. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste. that all the days of your life you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. No leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory for 7 days, nor shall any of the flesh that you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain all night until morning. Okay, so the bread, and there's more rules there about the bread. It's called the bread of affliction is the name of the bread. It is unleavened. So if you have any Jewish friends to this day who practice the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the 7 days of unleavened bread, they are supposed to go through an exercise where they clean their house. And it's a tradition. They go through and they clean the house, and they take out anything that has leaven in it, or what do we call it? Yeast, thank you. Yeast is what we call it today. They get rid of anything, so they throw out their yeast, they throw out anything that has yeast in it, anything that is fermented is also thrown out. So the friends that I had that were Jewish that I mentioned from time to time, okay, so there's a Pharisaical discussion about what it means to be thrown out, what is inside the house, what's outside the house, okay. But they would take all of their stuff and put it into a freezer, a refrigerator freezer, and then they would wrap a chain around it and put a padlock on it. Now, there was some question as to whether it was still in the house because it was kind of in a mud room. So it wasn't in the house proper, but it was in a room that was attached to the house. You had to walk through on your way to get into the house. So there was some question about that. But anyway, so you'll see things like that, where the cupboards might be locked. They might have a shed out back where things are stored because they don't want to throw it away outright. But they kind of get rid of everything. So and it's called the bread of affliction. Then in Exodus 24, there is blood that is mentioned at the making of the covenant, verses 7 and 8. Exodus. Sorry, I was in Deuteronomy. Exodus 24. This is the making of the covenant at Sinai. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of all the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." This is the Jewish people, the people of Israel. This is their vow. Okay, this is the vow as they enter into the covenant with Yahweh, with the Lord, with Jehovah. All that the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, he was sprinkling it with hyssop. Okay, he wasn't like throwing lots of blood on them, but he was still sprinkling them with blood. He threw it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." And the word Lord there is Jehovah. So here is the blood as it references the covenant. And then Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement, blood sacrifice. The high priest shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people. So remember the Lamb of God. The sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil of the temple, well, the tabernacle at this point. And do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgressions and all their sins. Okay, so atonement is made by this blood on the Day of Atonement. Okay, so we have this blood that's referenced there. Okay, so I'm giving a whole bunch of puzzle pieces here as we look at Matthew 26. And I want to draw connections to each of these from what is happening at the Lord's table. I put the text of Mark in there. But that was Mark. Mark is almost exactly the same as Matthew. Luke is different, and I don't want to talk about all the differences with Luke. Luke goes into more detail. 1 Corinthians we read this morning. Okay. So here's I was ahead of myself. Okay, so unleavened bread. All right, so in Deuteronomy 16, It's called the bread of affliction. So I'm going to flip back to Matthew 26. And I'm going to, just to draw the parallel here in Matthew 26. Okay. So Jesus took the bread. He took the bread of affliction and blessed it. And it would have been like a flat loaf, because it's unleavened, you recall. He would have broke a piece off and then handed the loaf off, and everyone else would have broken a piece off. Okay. My wife makes the communion bread. It's a flat loaf. It's unleavened, right? Yeah, okay, good. It's unleavened, but she does the breaking, just for convenience sake. There are many churches actually that don't break the loaf until the communion service itself, as we're gathered around the table. It's a matter of convenience that we break it ahead of time. But anyway, but it's the bread of affliction, the affliction that was suffered by the people of Israel on the day that they were delivered. And this is the one that Jesus is picking up. This is the loaf of bread that he's picking up. And originally, what they were supposed to be doing is remembering the day of deliverance, the Passover, the original Passover, the day that they were thrust out of Egypt in great haste. So what is Jesus doing with this? Okay, so here, Jesus says, this is my body. Okay, hoc est meus corpus, which is where the phrase hocus pocus comes from. Hocus pocus is making fun of the Latin, hoc est meus corpus. This is my body, which is given for you. And actually, you'll notice that it says, he says, take, eat, this is my body. In Matthew's account, it doesn't say that it was broken for us, but I think in somebody's account it is. So we add it in there sometimes. So what does Jesus mean that the bread of affliction is his body? So the parallel I think that he's making here is that the affliction suffered by Christ on the day of his death. So Christ goes through great affliction when he dies. Okay, so he's arrested, he's beaten, he's whipped, he's spit upon, he has to carry his own cross for a little ways. And then, of course, he's crucified, which is one of the most excruciating deaths that mankind has come up with for other humans. And so this physical affliction is really what we're supposed to be, in part, remembering when we have communion. Okay, when we observe the Lord's Supper or the Lord's table, we are in part remembering this physical affliction that he's going through, and is supposed to be part of what we're doing when we're breaking the bread together. That this is the breaking of his body. So this is one parallel that's being put together. So is Jesus the Messiah? He is, but remember in Daniel 9, the Messiah is cut off. Now Daniel doesn't explain what that means. There are other passages like Isaiah 53 that I think do give detail as to what that means. And the disciples on this night don't yet know what it means. They're not going to know what that means for another couple days, because it's going to be over the next 36 hours that Jesus goes through all of this physical suffering. But he gave it to us already. And you'll notice that he says he's not going to partake of this meal with them until the kingdom comes. And Jesus does not participate in this ceremony today with us because the kingdom is still future. Okay, so we're not in the kingdom. The kingdom is still future. So that's the physical part of it. That's the bread. Now, the grape juice or the wine. Now, it's translated wine, and partly because, actually it's not translated as wine. I'll point that out first, then we'll talk about the word wine. He says, he took a cup, and when he had given it to them, saying, drink it all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. You'll notice that the word wine is not used. And in verse 29 it says, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine. Well, what is the fruit of the vine? It's grapes. Is it fermented grapes or is it unfermented grapes? It's unfermented because it's the Passover. Anything that was fermented or leavened or had yeast in it was thrown out. So there was no fermented wine. But I think I'm just going to jump over to Luke because on the cup. So Luke says in Luke 22, let's see. And the order's a little different in Luke 22. He says, he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, take this, divide it among yourselves, for I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he takes bread, and then he takes a second cup. So again, I don't want to get into all the details of the two cups, but he takes a second cup, and he says, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. And again, he doesn't use the word wine. He just uses the word cup. So, so when wine is mentioned or grape juice is mentioned in the Bible, it's the same word in Greek for both. We have grape juice, we have that word, and we have wine. The word wine actually comes from the Greek word for wine. But because it's the same word, and I think I talked about this once before, it's not always alcoholic. We always think of wine as being something that is alcoholic. And in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, it's not always something that is intoxicating. That's the word I'm stretching for. So we I would say, rightly use grape juice here in our celebration. Okay, so the cup that has unfermented wine in it, or grape juice. So I mentioned it represents blood, and it represents the blood of the covenant. Verse 28 of Matthew 26, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. So the blood of the covenant. Well, what covenant is he talking about? Luke adds the word new. Luke has the word new covenant there. It's the blood of the covenant. So in Exodus 24, the passage that we read there, blood accompanied the making of the covenant. Now, not all covenants in the Bible have blood accompanying them. The Davidic covenant, for example, does not. There's no sacrifice with the Davidic covenant. So the blood in Exodus 24, it was ceremonial. It was part of the ceremony. It was circumstantial. It didn't make the people part of the covenant. Their vow made them part of the covenant. Okay, so it was symbolic. And we're told in Exodus 24 that it was sanctifying or purifying. So everyone who made that covenant at that point in time, it was a symbol of purification or sanctification. So when Jesus is using that phrase, my blood is the blood of the covenant, well, he's obviously not referring to the covenant made at Sinai directly. He's not saying my blood is the blood of the covenant made at Sinai. He's saying that my blood is like the blood that was poured out at Sinai. Well, in what way? There's the second one. Okay, so we'll talk about the two. The other is the blood of the sin offering, which is Leviticus 16. Atonement of sins, forgiveness of sins, and sanctification. So he says, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So the blood of Jesus, his sacrifice, is doing two things. One, he references the covenant, and two, he references the forgiveness of sins. Okay, and those two things are not the same. They're two different things. The blood of the old covenant did not bring about salvation. And the blood of Christ. So the new covenant and forgiveness of sins. So let's go to the next slide then. Yeah. So Hebrews 9. I think the author of Hebrews makes this point that the blood of Jesus is doing two things. It gives us more information. Matthew is very short in what he records there. But I think Hebrews 9 gives us a lot more detail. So Matthew's arguing that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Where's his kingdom? It's still in the future. Okay, but Jesus died. Yes, he did, but his death accomplished two different things. And we know that he had to die. But what is the nature of his death? What two things did he accomplish for us? So in Hebrews 9, beginning in verse 15, the author says that Jesus is a mediator of a new covenant so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. So the author is making a comparison between the first covenant, that's the one at Sinai, and this new covenant. And Jesus is going to make a new covenant with the people who were given a promise under the old covenant, but sinned. Okay, so this is also Jeremiah 31. Jesus' blood is going to guarantee this. Okay, so verse 16 says, he's using an analogy that there's a will. Someone died and left a will. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. So Jesus made a promise to the people of Israel, and what the author of Hebrews is arguing is in order to keep that promise, he had to die. And we knew this from the Old Testament. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not enforced as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. The first covenant, again, is Sinai, and that's Exodus 24. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of the calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." Okay. And in the same way, he sprinkled the blood, both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Or transgression. Yeah, sins, says here. Okay, and then down to verse 27, just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who eagerly wait for him. So there are two things happening in Hebrews chapter 9. There's the covenant, and there is the forgiveness of sins. So we have both of them going on here in Hebrews 9. And I referenced those verses, and even up above, I guess, verses 9 through 11, Jesus' sin with blood. Verse 12, for example, Hebrews 9:12, Jesus entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. All right, so Jesus had to die for two reasons. One, to guarantee the new covenant would occur. Now, so just to refresh our memories, when will Jesus make the new covenant with the people of Israel? Pop quiz. After the tribulation period and before the kingdom starts. Okay, so in the time in between, Hosea 2, Jesus will come back, Revelation 19. He will take the people of Israel, Hosea 2, out into the wilderness. He will make the new covenant with them where he will be their God and they shall be his people and their relationship will be restored. And then he will march them back into the promised land, which is mentioned here in Hebrews 9, the promised eternal inheritance. He will march them back into the promised land. And I think also at this time, like Old Testament saints are resurrected. Abraham, David, Jeremiah, all of them will be resurrected and they will join the party in their resurrected bodies. They will receive their inheritance that was promised to them. Hebrews 11. So that's when that happens. Well, if Jesus is dying, and it's going to be a little ways before the new covenant is made, how do we know for sure that it's going to be made? What's the guarantee? How do we know the promise is sure? Okay, Jesus' death. So when the Jewish people are asking Matthew, was Jesus the king? Yes, he was. Where's the kingdom? It's in the future. What's going on now? This thing called the church. Okay, but how do we know he's going to come back and make and establish the kingdom and the new covenant with us like the Old Testament promises? He died to secure it. Okay, his death, his blood is the blood of the covenant. And it's already been shed to show you, to prove to you that it's going to happen. And I think the author of Hebrews brings that out a little bit. And then, so what about the forgiveness of sins? So Matthew 26 says he died for the forgiveness of sins. And Hebrews here mentions that as well. Securing our eternal redemption. Verse 22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Christ was already offered once. And so his first coming, according to Hebrews 9, 27 and 28, the purpose of Jesus' first coming was to die for the sins of the whole world. The next time he comes, then it will be to judge. So his second coming is about judgment. And verse 28, to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Well, who is eagerly waiting for him when Jesus comes back the second time to set up his kingdom? Okay. Well, when he comes back to set up his kingdom, we're already with him. The church is already with Jesus. The people of Israel, his brothers, remember that they're persecuted that last 3.5 years, and they're eagerly waiting for him to come back to make the new covenant and to set up the kingdom. Now, we are eagerly waiting for him, but for the rapture. And then